Did you know that over 120 million people are forcibly displaced worldwide? This means that 1 in every 69 people is displaced. These aren't just numbers. Behind each forced displacement lies a story of a family that suffers, a child separated from her mother, a girl longing to continue her education, an elderly man who died because his hospital was bombed. These are stories of war, conflict, and power struggles where millions suffer without their fault. In this video, we will cover all of these aspects. We will tell you the human stories behind these numbers. Since October 7th, Israel's relentless bombardment has killed more than 37,000 people in Gaza, and the majority of them are innocent children. Those who have still survived this bloody war live in constant fear of death. In Gaza, the ultimate wish of millions is to return to their homes. Rafah, once a city of 300,000, now has 1.5 million internally displaced Palestinians swarming its streets, all searching for refuge. Privacy is a rare luxury here, and you never know when another bomb will explode nearby. 1.5% of the entire world's population is forcibly displaced due to persecution, conflict, violence, wars, or human rights violations. As we already have mentioned, 1 person out of every 69 is forcibly displaced, and this number has been increasing every year for the past 12 years. Over the past decade, the forcibly displaced population has doubled. Zahra Nader is an Afghan Canadian journalist and editor-in-chief of Zan Times, a newly launched media outlet that covers marginalized communities in Afghanistan, particularly women and the LGBTQ community. We talked to her to discuss why this number is increasing continuously.
The more conflict we see, we know that more people are losing their homes and they have to flee, especially in the face of a conflict. For example, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Myanmar, besides what have already happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Ukraine. So we are seeing this new conflict are actually adding to the number of displaced people, to the number of people who had to flee their home to remain safe, to survive.
The UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, categorizes forcibly displaced people into different groups. The majority, nearly 58% or about 69 million, are internally displaced persons, IDPs. These individuals are displaced within their own country due to conflict. The remainder are refugees, people who are forced to flee their home countries to escape persecution or a serious threat to their life, physical integrity, or freedom. Globally, there are 43.4 million refugees, and this number has tripled in the last decade. We asked Nader if UNHCR is doing enough to protect refugees.
Talking from the perspective of a journalist, I should be cautious that it's not about me saying that are they doing their part or not, because I believe that they are doing their work. But the problem is, as we are seeing the number grows, the demand for their work grows. And are they able to meet the demand? I don't believe so, because from what I'm seeing, from what we are hearing, especially in relation to Afghan refugees, we know that many of them are telling us that, for example, they have registered with UNHCR a year ago, and they have not yet been asked for an interview. So we understand, and there are many of them who have been waiting for years to be able to call in for interview and to be able to resettle in a safe country. That's not happening as fast as people want this to be happening. And I'm feeling that there is kind of the demand is very high for their work, as we are seeing more conflict.
In 1951, the UN established the Refugee Convention to protect the rights of refugees in Europe after World War II. In 1967, its mandate was expanded to address displaced people across the world. At that time, there were 2.1 million refugees worldwide. Today, this figure is 58 times bigger. This situation significantly changed during the 1980s due to wars in Afghanistan and Ethiopia. By the 1990s, the number of refugees had risen to 20 million, marking the beginning of the internal displacement crisis. The invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq by the United States after 9/11, along with the civil wars in South Sudan and Syria, led to a substantial increase in the number of refugees, surpassing 30 million by the end of 2021. In February 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered one of the fastest-growing refugee crises since World War II. In less than a year, 5.7 million people fled Ukraine. The year 2023 was hard for the people of Sudan. The conflict between the country's army and paramilitary forces caused millions of Sudanese to either leave the country or face internal displacement. Sudan, which was home to millions of refugees from Eritrea, South Sudan, and Syria before this war, now sees these refugees forced to find new places to live. This highlights a tragic cycle, fleeing one country to save your life, only to encounter similar dangers elsewhere, prompting yet another flight. Nader also spent her childhood as a refugee in Iran and faced discrimination. She described some of the hardships she faced.
I was a refugee in Iran, and I remember when I talk about my experience of being a refugee in Iran, I suffered racism. Very brutal kind of racism, and I was denied the right to education because I was a refugee. I was a refugee in Iran in 1990s when the Taliban first take over.
This problem is further complicated by the fact that 75% of refugees are hosted by low and middle-income countries. These already volatile and struggling economies often fail to provide basic necessities such as education and healthcare to these new arrivals. Nearly 40% of forcibly displaced persons are children, and such conditions make survival even more challenging for them. Crossing into a new country isn't easy either. In April 2024, a boat carrying 140 Rohingya refugees capsized off Indonesia, resulting in 67 deaths while others were rescued. The incident made headlines, and an investigation later revealed that the boat had not capsized by accident. There was no storm or engine failure. Rather, an AP reporter discovered that the captain had deliberately sunk the boat after being refused more girls to rape. Nader thinks it's because of impunity for crimes against refugees.
Start with the host country see every refugee as a human, and then apply the same law that they have from their own country to the refugees, and don't see them as out of the box, so we can do anything to them and just be okay with that. This should not be seen because they're human. Their human rights should be guaranteed regardless of what's happening or who they are, right? Then we could have that, when a woman is raped, they should be able to go to the police and complain and bring those people who are culprit to justice. But unfortunately, for the refugees, because most of them don't have the luxury of having a visa and things like that, they won't be able to go to the police and complain. And even if they go to, and if the culprit is from that country, most of the time these people say like, oh, you are in my country and now you come and complain about, a citizen of my country. Those are the kind of response that they would get. So it makes the vulnerable more vulnerable, and just leave them to fend for themselves, and that's difficult.
These incidents are not isolated. Interviews with 31,500 refugees along the central Mediterranean route revealed severe threats to their lives, including rape, torture, kidnapping, arbitrary detention, robbery, and human trafficking. Between 2021 and 2023, at least 950 people are known to have died while crossing the Sahara Desert, though the actual number is likely much higher. During the same period, 7,600 people on the move died or went missing in the Mediterranean Sea. Another significant problem refugees face in host countries is xenophobia, or hatred against these individuals. Pakistan has hosted millions of Afghans for decades, and during their time there, Afghans have faced racism and prejudice, and many still face it. Pakistani sociologist Nida Kamani attributes this to state-sponsored propaganda that frames Afghans as enemies.
Also in Pakistan, what we are seeing that the government of Pakistan is forcefully returning these refugees to Afghanistan where their lives are at risk. So to give you one example, I remember we did one interview or one story about the particular situation of refugees in Pakistan. We interviewed one woman, she was a lawyer, and she was saying that I cannot live in Afghanistan, I have to flee. She had children, and I think the youngest one 1 year old. And when the Pakistan started forcefully deporting them in November, I think it was second day of November that they received a knock on their door. The event was in early morning. And then just the Pakistani police came and took them out. And she said, I was not able to dress my kids. And then they were taken to a detention center where they told us that they were kept there for 24 hours without water and food. And his young boy, the 1-year-old, was sick. So she had to get her to the doctor. So she cried and she asked for help, and it was only her and her children was able to go out to a doctor. To the rest of her family, her young kids were staying in the prison. And then because she was the lawyer, she was able to get help from Lawyers Association in Pakistan and abroad, and was able to flee her family. But that's not the case for other refugees who are facing this situation, which is very brutal, very hard, especially the fact that where are they going back? There's nothing to go back to. And that's very true for the woman who doesn't have a life in Afghanistan, unfortunately.
After the Taliban takeover of Kabul in August 2021, nearly 600,000 Afghans fled to Pakistan. In 2023, amid growing terrorism and insurgency, the Pakistani government blamed the Taliban for facilitating terrorism and deported more than 1 million Afghans. During this expulsion, many were exploited by locals and mistreated by authorities. Many experts and human rights activists opposed it and called for a different solution. They think it won't solve Pakistan's security problems.
Deporting all of Afghan refugees is not going to solve the problem of Pakistan, because it's an ideological problem. It's a tension they have with the Taliban, and this should be solved in other ways. But refugees have nothing to do with this. No matter how many Afghan refugees Pakistan decide to deport, it's not going to change Taliban in Afghanistan, because Pakistani Taliban is actually an ally and so-called brothers to Afghan Taliban. So for the Pakistan government to believe that by deporting more Afghan refugees, they might be able to create a gap or create a way for this brotherhood to break, I don't think so. This is gonna work for them. And the only thing I see is the most vulnerable, the most poor, the most marginalized is suffering. Only it's them that's suffering under this situation, and it's not going to harm the Taliban. Unfortunately, it could have been differently if Pakistan have considered the policy of strategic depth toward Afghanistan. But I think it's very much late right now for what the Pakistan could have done differently, but it didn't. And unfortunately, that crisis that Pakistan helped create is now, it's the kind of chicken who now come back home to harm, unfortunately, Pakistan as well. And we hope that the people of Pakistan wake up and understand that, by setting fire in your neighbor's house, your house is not going to be safe.
Nearly 3/4, or 72%, of all refugees come from just 5 countries: Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and Palestine, with more than 6 million people fled from each of these countries. The majority of these refugees relocate to 5 countries: Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Germany, and Pakistan. The majority of these countries host refugees because they share borders with them. But Germany is an exception here. It does not border the main refugee source countries, but provides shelter to millions of Ukrainians, Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis. Racist and prejudiced behavior is prevalent in many host countries. In Germany, migrant players on the national football team have faced racist comments. This issue is also highly visible in Iran, Pakistan, and to some extent in the US and other European and Latin American countries. Nader believes that the racism and discrimination that refugees face in host countries is often down to the media, which frequently portrays them as a burden on these nations.
When I talk about the level of racism in Iran, I'm horrified of seeing that some media is actually reporting unlogical lies that is very hard to grasp. It's not based on the reality. So, for example, I remember one of the biggest newspaper in Tehran. I think they put a huge numbers and said, so there were different kind of reports that were created to ignite hatred, to ignite racism against the Afghan refugees. One of them said something that I think it's one part of Tehran is now occupied by Afghan refugees, and that I don't know how, I don't exactly remember the percentage, but they put a high percentage and said the rate of Afghan refugees, child bringing is this high, and that means few years down the road they're going to take over Iran. And then recently I saw there was another piece written in some very kind of semi-prestigious not outlet, but by a group, and then they were claiming that the government of Iran is actually allowing more refugees to come. So instead, these refugees will be used against the people of Iran, because they will be supporting the Iran's government against Iranian interests. So these are the kind of narrative that's actually preparing the scene for violence against refugees, for hatred, for racism. And unfortunately, if this continues, this will lead to massacre, to the killing, the people losing their lives, because when the level of racism and hatred is high, people are willing to do things that they don't usually do.
Okay, so let's discuss the second category of forcibly displaced people, IDPs, or internally displaced persons. We mentioned them briefly earlier, but here's a more detailed explanation. There are 68.3 million people in this category, and they constantly face threats to their safety. Compared to 2022, the number of IDPs grew by 10% in 2023. We've talked about Sudan's refugees, but within Sudan, there are 9.1 million internally displaced people. Syria has 7.2 million IDPs, and Congo has 6.7 million. Sudan, Syria, and the DRC are also facing widespread hunger. In Myanmar, nearly 4 million people are internally displaced, constantly risking their lives due to ongoing violence and persecution. Those who have fled the country are living in dire conditions in Bangladesh, Malaysia, and India. So, what are the solutions to this issue? Should refugees return to their homes? If they do, will they find peace, security, and basic necessities? Amnesty International reported that when Syrian refugees returned to their homes between 2017 and 2021, they were subjected to torture, detention, and disappearance by security forces. Data from UNHCR indicates that 1.1 million refugees returned to their homes in 2023. 4 out of 5 who returned were either Ukrainian or South Sudanese, but Ukraine is still facing war, and the situation in South Sudan is far from ideal. So, is returning home really a solution to this problem? And what role should the media play in this crisis?
Welcoming the refugees to write for the media, to give them a platform to represent themselves, because representation is very important. When people don't have a voice, it's very hard for the people on that particular place to connect with them. I would say it's very important. So if there are Afghan refugees, journalists in your community, give them a platform, allow them to write, to report about their own situation, about what's happening, and also to highlight the success stories of the refugees who have not stolen our opportunities, who have not done wrong with us, and instead highlight the stories of the people who are actually hardworking people who are contributing to the growth of the host country. And we know that there are many refugees who build lives, who build companies, places, who are serving this country, and they are thankful for the life they have in their host country, like the way I am here. I'm thankful. I'm a refugee. I came as a refugee in Canada. I'm an immigrant woman here, but I'm thankful for the opportunities I was given. And definitely, when I finish my schools and everything, I will be contributing to the growth of this country. So those are the stories that should be told in this community. That the crisis in Ukraine showed us that there are better ways that refugee could be treated. And we should learn from that. And that should be the lesson for all the countries, that all the refugees deserve to be treated like that.
In the end, please remember before abusing refugees that
No person would leave their homes if they have a good life, if they have a situation that they can live in dignity there. Nobody wants to be, like in someone else's land and be faced with racism and difficulty of life. They have no choice. That's why they had to flee.